The winter of 1818 had been the season of Michelle Hartley's quiet resignation and unexpected reversal. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. At 27, Miss Michelle Hartley, eldest daughter of the late merchant Thomas Hartley and stepdaughter to Lady Hartley, had long since ceased expecting notice from society. Her father's fortune had secured her stepmother's position, but Michelle herself possessed none of the advantages that opened London's gilded doors. Her dowry was modest, her beauty understated. Chestnut hair dressed simply, grey-green eyes that preferred observing to demanding attention, and a manner that came from genuine competence rather than practiced charm. She had never expected to be seen, much less chosen, and certainly not by Duke Kellen Anderson of Ravenshield. Where her stepsisters sparkled like carefully cut diamonds, Ava with her laugh that commanded rooms, Seraphina with her practiced grace, Lillian with her youthful audacity, Michelle had learned to move through spaces like air, necessary, unremarked upon, easily forgotten. She managed the Hartley household accounts while her stepmother took credit. She ensured the servants were paid while her sisters planned their wardrobes. She made certain the estate functioned while others enjoyed the fruits of that function. "You must accept your station, Michelle," Lady Hartley would say with theatrical sighs, always within earshot of guests. "Not every woman is destined to be admired. Some are meant to be useful." Michelle had accepted many things, but she had never accepted invisibility as virtue. Then came the winter assembly at Blackthorn Hall, an event designed to celebrate Ava's first anniversary as Lady Whitcomb. Michelle attended because duty demanded it, dressed in a gown of deep rose that her stepmother had called serviceable, the kind of word that meant adequate and forgettable in the same breath. She stood near the musicians, close enough to the edges that she could slip away unnoticed if needed, watching her sisters receive the admiration they'd been raised to expect. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and ambition, every unmarried lady positioned like chess pieces, every mama calculating advantages. Then the double doors opened, and the room inhaled as one. Duke Kellen Anderson had arrived. He was power given mortal form, the most influential duke in Scotland, master of lands that rivaled entire counties, a man whose word carried weight in Parliament and whose presence could shift the fortunes of families. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the kind of austere features that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it less, cold, strategic, unmarried by deliberate choice. The Duke did not dance. He did not flatter. He did not waste his attention on spectacle, which made it impossible to explain why, as his gaze swept the assembled nobility with methodical assessment, it passed over Ava's practiced smile, Seraphina's graceful curtsy, Lillian's bold eye contact, and stopped on Michelle. She felt it like a physical weight, his attention settling on her with the precision of a hawk selecting prey. Her breath caught. Around her, she could sense the subtle shifts of awareness, other guests noticing where the Duke's focus had landed, confusion rippling through the crowd like disturbed water. "He's looking past me," she told herself. "At someone behind me. At something else." But his gaze didn't move. For 3 heartbeats that felt like hours, Duke Kellen Anderson studied Michelle Hartley with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Not the way men usually looked at women in ballrooms, assessing beauty, calculating advantage. This was something different, something that felt like recognition. Then he moved, and the spell broke. He turned to greet his host, and the room released its collective breath. Michelle pressed her palm against her ribs, feeling her heart hammer beneath whalebone and silk. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly. Powerful men look at many things. but throughout the evening she felt his attention return. When she spoke with elderly Lord Pemberton about crop rotation and tenant welfare, when she stepped aside so a servant could pass with a tray, when she quietly corrected an error in the evening's printed schedule that would have embarrassed their host. While others performed, Michelle functioned. And somehow, inexplicably, the Duke of Ravenshield kept watching. They spoke only once, late in the evening, when Michelle had retreated to the library, seeking respite from the glittering chaos. She had been examining a volume on Scottish agricultural reform when his voice came from the doorway, low and precise. "Miss Hartley." She turned, heart leaping into her throat. "Your Grace." He entered the room with measured steps, his dark evening clothes making him seem like a shadow given substance. "You understand land management?" It wasn't a question, but Michelle answered anyway. "I understand responsibility, Your Grace. Land simply reveals it." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, but a softening around his eyes that suggested one might exist beneath his austere exterior. "Most ladies of your age concern themselves with securing husbands, not improving agricultural yields." "Perhaps that's why most ladies marry poorly," Michelle replied, then felt heat flood her cheeks at her own boldness. "Forgive me, that was impertinent." "That was honest." He studied her for another long moment. "Honesty is a rarity in London drawing rooms, Miss Hartley. Even rarer in women who have reason to guard their tongues." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. They both understood what he meant. Women with uncertain positions learn to say what others wish to hear. "I prefer clarity to charm, Your Grace," Michelle said quietly, "even when charm might serve me better." "Charm is performance," the Duke replied. "Clarity is precision. I've always valued the latter over the former." Then, with a slight bow, he left her standing among the books, her hands trembling and her mind racing with questions she didn't dare voice. "It means nothing," she told herself again as her family's carriage rolled through the dark streets toward home, her stepsisters chattering about their triumphs. The Duke was simply being polite. But 3 days later, a carriage bearing the black-crested Ravenshield seal arrived at the Hartley estate, and nothing in Michelle's carefully ordered world would ever be the same. Before that moment of rupture, however, there had been the ball itself, the winter assembly at Blackthorn Hall that would become the turning point Michelle hadn't known she was waiting for. Blackthorn Hall had been ablaze with 1,000 candles the night of Ava's anniversary celebration. The ancient manor, all honey-colored stone and soaring ceilings, had been transformed into a cathedral of ambition. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across polished marble floors. Hothouse flowers, impossible blooms coaxed into winter existence at ruinous expense, spilled from gilt vases in cascades of cream and crimson. The air itself seemed dense with perfume, beeswax, and the particular tension that came when England's elite gathered to see and be seen. Michelle had positioned herself near the musician's alcove, close enough to appear present, but far enough to avoid notice. Her gown of deep rose, serviceable, her stepmother had called it with that particular inflection that meant adequate for someone of your position, blended into the shadows while her stepsisters occupied the light. And occupy it they did. Ava held court near the refreshment tables, her laugh pitched to carry across the room. Serafina glided through a quadrille with practiced perfection, every gesture calculated for maximum effect. Even young Lillian, barely 20, commanded attention with the kind of bold confidence that comes from never having been ignored. Michelle watched them with the detachment of long practice. This was their world. She was merely its steward, the one who ensured the household ran smoothly so they could shine. Society had long since decided her place in its hierarchy. Useful but unremarkable, competent but unchosen, the spinster sister who made certain everyone else's lives functioned properly. She had made peace with that role, or so she told herself. Then the double doors opened with a resonance that silenced the orchestra mid-phrase. Duke Kellen Anderson of Ravenshield entered, and the ballroom collectively held its breath. He moved through the crowd like winter itself, cold, inevitable, commanding. His dark, evening clothes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At perhaps 35, he possessed the kind of austere authority that made younger men straighten their spines and ambitious mamas calculate frantically. The most powerful duke in Scotland, unmarried by choice, unmoved by spectacle. Michelle felt the room's energy shift, everyone subtly reorienting toward him like flowers tracking the sun. Ava's laugh became more musical. Seraphina's posture grew impossibly more graceful. Lillian's eyes widened with predatory interest. The Duke's gaze swept the assembled nobility with methodical precision. Past Lord Pemberton's greeting, past the eager debutantes arranged like offerings, past Ava's studied charm, Seraphina's practiced elegance, Lillian's bold invitation, and stopped on Michelle. The world narrowed to that single point of connection. His eyes, dark, intelligent, assessing, held hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unwelcome awareness. Not admiration, not attraction, something far more unsettling. Recognition. Around her, Michelle sensed the subtle shifts of confusion, guests noticing where Scotland's most powerful nobleman had focused his attention and finding the choice incomprehensible. "He's looking past me," she told herself, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. At something else. Someone else. But his gaze didn't move, and for the first time in 27 years, Michelle Hartley felt truly, terrifyingly seen. The moment passed. The Duke turned to acknowledge his host, and the ballroom exhaled. The orchestra resumed. Conversation swelled again, though now threaded with whispered speculation about where Scotland's most eligible nobleman had directed his attention. Michelle pressed deeper into the shadows near the musicians, willing her heartbeat to steady. It meant nothing. Powerful men look at many things. But throughout the evening, she felt his attention return. When elderly Lord Pemberton cornered her near the terrace doors, eager to discuss his struggling estate in Northumberland, Michelle listened with genuine interest. "The tenants are good people, Miss Hartley," he said wearily, "but the land yields less each year, and I haven't the knowledge to understand why." "Have you considered crop rotation, my lord?" Michelle asked gently. "Planting legumes every third season can restore nutrients to exhausted soil, and ensuring tenants have secure leases, 20 years rather than 7, gives them incentive to invest in the land's improvement rather than simply extracting what they can." Lord Pemberton's eyes brightened. "My dear, that's remarkably astute." From across the room, Michelle felt it again, that weight of observation. She glanced up to find the Duke standing in conversation with the Earl of Blackthorn, his posture suggesting polite attention to his host. But his gaze had drifted, fixed on her with that same unsettling intensity. Later, when a servant stumbled beneath the weight of a champagne tray, Michelle was the only guest who stepped aside rather than back, creating space for the young man to recover his balance rather than forcing him to navigate around nobility. The Duke noticed. She saw it in the slight tilt of his head, the way his attention sharpened. And when Lady Whitcomb, Ava, loudly corrected the evening's program, insisting the supper dance was meant to be a waltz when the printed schedule clearly stated quadrille, Michelle quietly intervened. "Forgive me, sister, but I believe the musicians prepared the quadrille. Perhaps we might honor their preparation. No performance, no false sweetness, simply clarity offered without cruelty." The Duke's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something that suggested one might exist beneath his austere exterior. They spoke only once, late in the evening. Michel had retreated to the library, seeking respite from glittering chaos, when his voice came from the doorway. "Miss Hartley." She turned, heart leaping. "Your Grace." He entered with measured steps. "You understand land management." "I understand responsibility, Your Grace. Land simply reveals it. Most ladies of your age concern themselves with securing husbands, not improving agricultural yields." "Perhaps that's why most ladies marry poorly," Michel replied, then felt heat flood her cheeks. "Forgive me, that was impertinent." "That was honest." His dark eyes held hers. "Honesty is a rarity in London drawing rooms, Miss Hartley. Even rarer in women who have reason to guard their tongues." "I prefer clarity to charm, Your Grace, even when charm might serve me better. Charm is performance. Clarity is precision." Something flickered in his expression. "I have always valued the latter over the former." He bowed slightly and departed, leaving Michel among the books with trembling hands and racing thoughts. In the carriage home, her stepsisters chattered about their conquests. Michel stared out at the dark streets, telling herself the evening had meant nothing. But in his own carriage, Duke Kellen Anderson sat in thoughtful silence, turning a single phrase over in his mind like a coin that had landed on its edge. Michel Hartley. He would remember that name. 3 days after the winter assembly, a carriage bearing the black-crested Ravenshield seal arrived at the Hartley estate. The household erupted into barely contained chaos. Lady Hartley's hands flew to her cheeks with theatrical delight. "Ava, Seraphina, the Duke has come calling." "Quickly, no, Ava, you must wear the blue muslin. Seraphina, fix your hair. Lillian, for heaven's sake, pinch some color into your cheeks." Michel retreated to the morning room, grateful to escape the frenzy. Whatever business brought the Duke to their modest estate had nothing to do with her. Powerful men didn't call on spinsters who spoke too plainly and managed household accounts. The butler's voice carried, from the entrance hall, formal and uncertain. "His Grace requests an audience with Miss Michel Hartley." Silence fell like a curtain dropping. Michel's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Surely she'd misheard. Surely. "There must be some mistake." Lady Hartley's voice came, shrill with confusion. "My stepdaughter. But that is, surely the Duke means." "I mean exactly what I said." The Duke's voice, calm and absolute, cut through the stammering. "Miss Michel Hartley, if she would be so kind." Michel set down her cup with trembling fingers. Every eye in the house tracked her as she crossed to her father's study, where the Duke waited in the leather-scented shadows. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, silhouetted against the weak winter light. When he turned, his expression was unreadable. "Miss Hartley." He inclined his head with precise courtesy. "Thank you for seeing me. Your Grace, I confess myself surprised by... I will be direct." He moved closer, his dark eyes steady on hers. "I require a wife, not an ornament to display at social functions, not a delicate creature who requires constant management. I require a partner, someone competent, intelligent, and uninterested in the performance that passes for matrimony among the ton." Michel's breath caught. "I don't understand." "I believe you do." His gaze didn't waver. "You understand estates and responsibility. You possess clarity of purpose without pretense. You see what needs doing and do it without requiring praise or recognition. These are qualities I value above beauty, above charm, above the shallow accomplishments society celebrates in women. Your Grace, I'm 27. I have no fortune, no connections that would advance your position. I have fortune and connections in abundance." A hint of impatience colored his tone. "What I lack is someone I can trust to manage what I've built without ego or ambition. Someone who values function over spectacle. Someone suitable." The word hung between them. Suitable. Not lovely, not charming, not desired. Suitable. Michelle thought of 1,000 small humiliations, her stepmother's pitying sighs, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the way society had written her story before she'd lived it. The eldest spinster, poor thing, destined to be useful, but never chosen. "You're offering marriage without affection," she said quietly. "I'm offering marriage with respect, partnership, honesty. Most matches among our class offer far less." He was right. She knew it bone deep. Ava's marriage to Lord Whitcomb was all performance and no substance. Seraphina's to Lord Fairmont was calculation without connection. Even Lillian's recent engagement seemed built on mutual vanity rather than mutual regard. Michelle could refuse, should refuse. This wasn't the romantic dream young girls whispered about. But at 7 and 20, she'd learned that dreams often obscured truth. She met the Duke's steady gaze. Yes. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them, a bargain struck, a future altered. "Then we are agreed." He bowed. "I will call again tomorrow to discuss arrangements." As his carriage rolled away, Michelle stood at the window, watching the black crest disappear down the lane. Behind her, she heard her stepmother's voice rising in shrill disbelief. The scandal, Michelle realized, was only just beginning. The engagement announcement appeared in the Morning Post 2 days later, and London society collectively lost its composure. His Grace, Duke Kellen Anderson of Ravenshield, to Miss Michelle Hartley, eldest daughter of the late Mr. Thomas Hartley. Not Ava, who had already secured a lord, not Seraphina with her practiced grace, not even young Lillian with her bold beauty. The spinster, the overlooked one, the woman who managed accounts while her sisters collected admirers. The drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed with barely concealed disbelief. She must have trapped him somehow, Lady Pembroke whispered behind her fan at the Duchess of Somerset's afternoon tea. No man of his standing would choose her unless compelled. "Perhaps she's with child," another voice suggested, scandalized and delighted in equal measure. "Don't be absurd. The Duke wouldn't even notice someone so unremarkable." Michelle heard the whispers, felt the stares when she entered shops, saw the pitying glances from women who believed she'd somehow deceived Scotland's most powerful nobleman into a disastrous match. But it was the venom within her own household that cut deepest. "I suppose desperation makes men foolish," Ava said at breakfast, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The Duke must be truly lonely to settle for you, Michelle." Seraphina's approach was more subtle, delivered with a smile sharp as glass. How fortunate that His Grace values practicality over more conventional charms. Not every man can appreciate a woman who smells of ledger books and household accounts. Lillian dispensed with subtlety entirely. "It's pathetic, really. You've spent your whole life invisible, and now you've managed to trick the most eligible man in Scotland into noticing you. I wonder how long before he realizes his mistake." Lady Hartley said nothing, but her tight-lipped silence communicated more than words. Disappointment that the family's greatest catch had gone to the daughter she'd never valued. Michelle endured it all with the same quiet strength she'd cultivated over 27 years. But late at night, alone in her chamber, as doubt crept in like cold fog. What if they're right? What if he does realize his mistake? Then the Duke began calling regularly, and Michelle started to understand. He didn't bring flowers or poetry. He brought estate documents for her review. He asked her opinion on tenant disputes, listened when she spoke, implemented her suggestions without condescension. In the privacy of the Hartley study, away from society's scrutiny, he treated her as precisely what he'd promised, a partner. "The northwest fields need drainage," Michelle said one afternoon, studying maps of Ravenshield's holdings. "The tenants could triple their yield if we invest in proper infrastructure," the Duke finished. "I agree. I've already instructed my steward to begin surveying. He glanced at her with something that might have been approval. You see what others overlook, Miss Hartley. That is precisely why I chose you. Chose. Not settled for. Not compromised. Chose. The realization settled into Michelle's chest like warmth spreading through winter-cold hands. 2 weeks before the wedding, an invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, sealed with a royal crest. The Royal Highland Ball, in honor of His Majesty's Scottish visit. The Duke's expression remained neutral as he handed Michelle the invitation. All of society will attend. They'll expect you to falter. Michelle met his steady gaze. Then we'll ensure I don't. The Royal Highland Ball at Edinburgh Castle was splendor weaponized. Every candle, every flower, every glittering surface designed to remind those present of their place in the hierarchy of power. The great hall soared overhead, its ancient stone walls draped with tartan silk in royal colors. 1,000 beeswax candles blazed in iron chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished silver and crystal until the very air seemed to shimmer. The Scottish nobility had gathered in their finest, lords in formal Highland dress, ladies in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year. At the far end, beneath a canopy embroidered with the royal arms, sat the visiting dignitaries who would bear witness to whatever unfolded tonight. Michelle stood near the entrance in a gown of midnight blue silk that the Duke had commissioned. Elegant, expensive, unmistakably declaring her new position. Yet she felt exposed, every eye tracking her movement, every whisper carrying her name like an indictment. The spinster who caught a duke. Ava swept past with Lord Whitcomb, her laugh brittle and too bright. How brave of you to attend, Michelle. Though I suppose when one has already secured a title through unconventional means, one needn't worry about appearances. Serafina glided closer, her smile venomous. That gown must have cost His Grace a fortune. I do hope you prove worth the investment. Men of his stature have been known to reconsider hasty decisions. Lillian simply stared, her young face twisted with resentment that bordered on hatred. Michelle held her spine straight, her hands steady at her sides. She had survived 27 years of being overlooked. She could survive one night of being seen. The orchestra played. Dancers swirled. Conversations ebbed and flowed around her like tide around a stone. Michelle remained at the periphery, waiting. Then the music stopped. Not a gradual fade, but an abrupt cessation that left the final note hanging in suddenly silent air. Every head turned toward the entrance. Duke Kellen Anderson of Ravenshield stood in the arched doorway, dark and imposing in formal Highland dress, the Ravenshield plaid across his shoulder like a declaration of war. His gaze swept the assembled crowd, hundreds of Scotland's elite, frozen in collective anticipation. The silence stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Michelle felt her heartbeat thunder in her ears. Around her, she sensed the cruel curiosity, the eager anticipation of humiliation. Would the Duke publicly acknowledge his mistake? Would he distance himself from the unremarkable woman he'd inexplicably chosen? Kellen's eyes found hers across the vast space of the great hall, and he stepped forward. Not toward the dignitaries, not toward the lords who sought his attention, not even toward propriety or expectation, toward Michelle. Each footfall echoed against stone, measured and deliberate. The crowd parted like water before the prow of a ship. 300 people held their breath as Scotland's most powerful nobleman crossed the ballroom, his focus absolute, his intention unmistakable. He stopped directly before Michelle. The world narrowed to his dark eyes, steady and certain. Then Duke Kellen Anderson of Ravenshield did something no one had ever seen him do. He knelt. The great hall held 300 souls, and not one of them breathed. Duke Kellen Anderson of Ravenshield, master of lands that rivaled kingdoms, advisor to Parliament, a man whose word could topple fortunes and elevate families, knelt before Michelle Hartley on the ancient stone floor of Edinburgh Castle. His voice carried through the silence with perfect clarity, pitched not for intimacy, but for witness. "Miss Michelle Hartley." He looked up at her, his expression solemn but unguarded. "I kneel before you and before Scotland to ask what I should have asked with greater ceremony from the beginning. Will you honor me as my wife? Not because you are suitable, though you are. Not because you are practical, though you possess more wisdom than most men I counsel, but because in a world of performance and pretense, you alone see clearly. You alone value truth over spectacle. You alone have earned not just my respect, but my devotion." The silence deepened impossibly. Michelle felt the weight of hundreds of stares, the collective shock of a society witnessing its hierarchy reordered in real time. She thought of 27 years of being overlooked. Every pitying glance, every dismissive word, every moment she'd been told her worth lay in being useful, never chosen. Every time she'd watched her stepsisters claim the admiration she'd learned not to expect. And she thought of the man kneeling before her, powerful enough to have anyone, yet choosing her with such deliberate certainty that he'd made it a public declaration. Michelle's hands, which had trembled when she dressed that evening, were perfectly steady now. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "I will." The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples transformed everything. Kellen rose with fluid grace, took her hand, and placed a ring on her finger, emerald surrounded by diamonds, the Ravenshield family stone. Then, in full view of Scottish nobility and crown witnesses, he raised her hand to his lips with a reverence that suggested she was porcelain and flame combined. The spell broke. Gasps erupted. Whispers became exclamations. The orchestra, receiving some unspoken signal, surged into a triumphant waltz, but Michelle heard none of it. She saw only the shift in her stepsisters' faces. Ava had gone white, her practiced composure cracking like fine china dropped on marble. Seraphina's carefully maintained superiority crumbled into naked envy. Lillian's young face twisted with an impotent fury that would leave scars on her soul for years. Lady Hartley stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, finally comprehending what she dismissed for nearly 3 decades. Michelle had never been unremarkable. She'd simply been waiting for someone powerful enough to see her worth. Around the ballroom, the whispers changed tenor. No longer mockery or disbelief. Now they carried awe, calculation, and grudging respect. The Duke kneels only for her. The most powerful nobleman in Scotland had rewritten the rules of precedence with a single gesture. Beauty meant less now. Charm carried less weight. Performance couldn't compete with substance. Michelle felt Kellen's hand at the small of her back, steady and possessive. "Shall we dance, Miss Hartley?" he asked quietly, his dark eyes holding a warmth she'd never seen before. "Let them watch. Let them understand." She placed her hand in his. "Yes, Your Grace. Let them see exactly what you've chosen." As they moved onto the floor, the crowd parted with deference that bordered on reverence. Michelle Hartley, overlooked, dismissed, deemed unremarkable for 27 years, danced at the center of Scotland's most important ball in the arms of its most powerful Duke. And the world, finally, understood what he'd known from the moment he'd seen her. Some women don't demand attention. They command it by simply being undeniable. They married 3 weeks later in the chapel at Ravenshield Keep. No grand ceremony, no performance for society's consumption. Just stone walls worn smooth by centuries, morning light through stained glass, and vows spoken with the kind of clarity that needed no audience to give them weight. "I promise you honesty," Kellen said. his hands steady on hers. Partnership. Respect that will not falter when fashion changes or society whispers. I promise you the same, Michelle replied. And competence. Always competence. His mouth curved, the first true smile she'd seen from him. I would expect nothing less. What followed surprised them both. Not love at first vow, but something more durable. Trust that deepened with each shared decision. Respect that grew into affection. Partnership that slowly, inevitably became devotion. Kellen gave Michelle authority over Ravenshield's extensive holdings, not nominal oversight, but genuine power. Estate stewards reported to her. Tenant disputes came to her judgment. Agricultural innovations bore her signature before his. The Northwest Drainage Project succeeded beyond projections, he told her one evening in his study, reviewing reports. The tenants are calling you the Duchess who listens. Michelle looked up from correspondence with a wool merchant. They simply needed someone to see the problem clearly, rather than profit from their struggle. Precisely why I chose you. He set down his papers and crossed to where she sat. You change things, Michelle. Make them better. Make them work. She'd blossomed under that trust. The woman who'd hidden at the edges of ballrooms now commanded rooms with quiet authority. Lords sought her counsel on estate management. Political wives deferred to her judgment. Even Parliament members consulted her on agricultural reform legislation. Meanwhile, her stepsisters' marriages fractured under the weight of their own hollowness. Ava's union with Lord Whitcomb had devolved into polite cohabitation, each seeking distraction from the other's company. Seraphina's carefully constructed elegance couldn't mask Lord Fairmont's flagrant infidelities. Lillian's engagement had collapsed entirely, her cruelty and vanity driving away the man who'd been foolish enough to propose. Lady Hartley wrote occasionally, her letters tinged with regret she'd never directly voice. Michelle responded with courtesy, but maintained firm distance. Some wounds didn't require forgiveness to heal. They simply required space. In the quiet moments, Michelle discovered something unexpected. Kellen's devotion hadn't been performance at the Royal Highland Ball. It was simply truth made visible. He sought her company without excuse, read beside her in companionable silence, asked her thoughts not from obligation but genuine curiosity, touched her hand when they passed in corridors. Small gestures that accumulated into something profound. One night, 2 years into their marriage, Michelle stood at the window of Ravenshield's master chamber, watching moonlight silver the grounds below. Kellen's arms came around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "That I was never unchosen," she replied. "I was simply waiting for the right choice." He turned her in his arms, his dark eyes holding hers with that same intensity from the night they'd met. But now warmth tempered the austere assessment. Now affection softened the precision. "And I," he said, "was waiting for someone who didn't need me to make her worthy. Someone who already was." He kissed her then, not with the careful respect of early marriage, but with the passionate certainty of earned love. Spring came to Ravenshield Keep with apple blossoms and the news that would complete their transformation from partnership to family. Michelle was carrying the next heir to Ravenshield. Their legacy had begun. 5 years after Duke Kellen Anderson knelt before Scotland, Michelle stood at the west window of Ravenshield Keep, watching her children play across the ancient stone terraces. James, 4 years old and solemn like his father, carefully helped his younger sister navigate the garden steps. Catherine, barely 2, laughed with the unrestrained joy of someone who'd never known what it meant to be dismissed or overlooked. Their third child, a son they'd named Thomas after Michelle's father, rested beneath her heart, dew when autumn turned the highlands gold. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across grounds that had become more home than the Hartley estate had ever been. Michelle had transformed Ravenshield not through grand gestures, but through the same quiet competence that had first caught Kellen's attention. Improved tenant housing, modernized irrigation, a school for estate children, innovations that made the land prosperous and the people secure. She was 32 now, no longer the spinster dismissed at ballroom edges, but the Duchess of Ravenshield, respected, consulted, indispensable to both her husband and the running of their extensive holdings. "You're thinking too much again." Kellen's voice came from behind her, warm with affection. Michelle smiled without turning. "I was remembering the winter assembly, how terrified I was when you looked at me." "Terrified?" He moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the unconscious ease of long intimacy. "You seemed remarkably composed for someone whose world was about to change." I'd spent 27 years learning to compose myself while drowning internally. She glanced at him, still austere, still precise, but with softness around his eyes that only she and their children ever saw. "I thought you were looking past me, at something more important." "I was looking at the most important thing in that room." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "A woman who didn't perform, who simply was, who valued substance over spectacle and truth over charm." Michelle watched James lift Catherine onto a garden bench, his small face serious with concentration. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing the eldest spinster over—" "Don't." Kellen's voice held gentle reproach. "You were never a spinster, Michelle. You were a woman waiting for someone who deserved you." She turned to face him fully. "I used to think I was unchosen, overlooked, inadequate. You were none of those things." His hands framed her face with reverence that 5 years hadn't diminished. "You were simply surrounded by people too blind to recognize quality when it stood before them. And you recognized it. I recognized you." He kissed her forehead, then her lips, soft and lingering. "The woman who improved my estates, challenged my assumptions, and gave me a family I didn't know I needed. The woman who made me kneel, not from duty, but from devotion." As if to prove the point, Kellen slowly knelt before her, not in the great hall before hundreds of witnesses, but in the privacy of their chamber with only afternoon light and enduring love as witness. He pressed his lips to her hand, then to her belly where their third child grew. "Still kneeling, Your Grace?" Michelle whispered, threading her fingers through his dark hair, now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples. "Always," he replied, looking up at her with eyes that held everything she'd once believed she'd never have. Choice, devotion, home. "For you, Michelle, always." And in that moment, standing in a room filled with light and love, Michelle finally understood the truth that had eluded her for so long. She had never been unchosen. She had simply been waiting, through humiliation and dismissal, through cruelty and doubt, for the one man powerful enough to see her worth. And when he did, he knelt. Not to elevate her, but to show the world what he'd known from the beginning. Some women don't need to be chosen by everyone. They only need to be chosen by the right one. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.